So on behalf of the Limestone Coast Landscape Board, I'd like to welcome and thank you all for taking time to tune into our Healthy Soils webinar series. This is the first of 5 webinars that the Limestone Coast Landscape Board will be presenting over the next coming months. So to begin with, I would like to acknowledge and pay respects to the traditional owners of the ancestral lands, Potterwich to the north, Jaradwajali to the east, Buendik to the south, and Miantung to the west of the Limestone Coast region. We acknowledge elders past and present, and we respect the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Aboriginal peoples to country. So I'll now do a few little introductions to our for our presenters. There's a great photo there of them. So our first presenter today is Claire, and I always describe Claire as the city girl with a country heart. Leaving Sydney 3.5 years ago, she made her way to Naracoorte to start work at Rural Solutions as a sustainable agricultural consultant. Claire's dedication to sustainable agriculture on the Limestone Coast continues to grow, and her ability to never shy of a challenge has seen her work on projects involving soil, pastures, cropping, livestock, land management, bees, and her current fascination catching and counting dung beetles. Today, she's heading back to her university foundations in geology to take us through the the formations of the Limestone Coast. And Mel, so after completing her schooling in Adelaide, Mel moved to the Eyre Peninsula to take a gap year working on a family farm. Touring the paddocks with an agronomist to collect soil samples, she became hooked on agriculture science and her passion for soil began. The following year, she started a Bachelor of Agriculture at the University of Adelaide, Roseworthy campus, and later completed it at the University of Guelph in Ontario, Canada. After a few years working on farms in Queensland, she moved back to Adelaide in 2005 to commence her PhD in soil science, exploring the soils of the Avenue Plain near Killara and the impact that the Fairview drains had on the local water table, and the expression of salinity and acidicity. It was during this time that she gained an intimate knowledge of the Limestone Coast and its formation, hydrology, and soil types. She completed 4 years in the Northern Territory after her PhD, and then moving back to Naracoorte in 2014 to take on her current role. She enjoys working across research and extension with an emphasis on sandy soils, calcareous clay soils, cover cropping, and regenerative agriculture. Her local knowledge and experience puts her in high demand, and her ability to relate to people from all walks of life has seen people embrace change and work towards bettering their soils. I would like to thank both of them for taking time out of their busy schedules today to come along and present today.
Yeah, thank you.
I will now hand over to Claire, who's going to take us through the geology of the Limestone Coast.
So geology, I'm Claire. I'm, as Skyly said, talking about the geological evolution of the Limestone Coast. And basically, geology is the foundation of life. Without rocks, we wouldn't have soils, and without soils, we wouldn't have life. So understanding what rocks we have, where they come from is really important for us to gain a perspective for our lives and our interactions with the planet. The bonus part is that geology is just really beautiful. So aside from geology, I love traveling, and I thought today we could all go on a holiday together. So I can see you're all keen to come with me since you've all brought your cameras in the form of your webcams. So I'm delighted to be your tour guide today for our little road trip across the Limestone Coast. And if you need anything at all, press your call bell by typing in the chat box. And there is one emergency exit located in the top right-hand corner, which is the red leave button. Buckle up. So I've planned our tour to see the major geological sites across the Limestone Coast. We'll start in Naracoorte, where I am today, to see our World Heritage listed caves. And I'll take you from Naracoorte westward to across our unique dunes and plains to Kingston, and from there head southwest to the volcanics around Mount Gambia. We'll have a look at some other significant geological attractions before we finish our day at Kunawa Terra. Before we go, we have some final planning to do. So we need to ensure we have everything, all the essentials packed for the trip, like lollies. So it's not a road trip without lollies, and my favourites are gobstoppers. So they change colour as you eat through them, so colour and flavour with depth, much like our planet. So a while back, 4.6 billion years ago, the Earth formed. All of what we see on our road trip of the Earth is the Earth's crust, shown here in blue and green. Underneath the crust is the mantle in red, and that's a viscous layer of molten rock called lava or magma. And underneath that, or deeper within, is the core, and there's a liquid outer core and a solid inner core, which are shown in orange and yellow. So after the Earth formed a while back, 4.6 billion years ago, basically there was not a lot going on for a few billion years. So there were some things, but we'll skip over them today because I want to fast forward to 300 million years ago. So we're up here in the Paleozoic period to a place called Pangaea. So Pangaea comes from the Greek word meaning all the earth, and it's the name of the supercontinent that existed way back 300 million years ago. It was surrounded by one ocean called Panthalassa. The idea of Pangaea originated from similarities in rock structures and fossils that were discovered on present-day continents, and also the observation that all the present-day continents fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. So those two things led to the revolutionary idea called plate tectonic theory. And plate tectonic theory was only largely accepted in the 1970s. So for me, I cannot fathom how anyone did geology without this theory. It just explains so much. So I do know a few people who did all their PhD and everything without this in play. And I just cannot imagine how we would explain some things in the Earth structure without it. So basically what this theory says is it says that the Earth's crust is made up of plates which slide along in the crust that slide along the mantle into their current position. So if you look on the right hand side, Pangaea rifted into two. So we had a northern part called Laurasia and a southern part called Gondwana. Now Australia was part of Gondwana. So Gondwana separated, and in that process Australia finally broke away from Antarctica. And that separation about 33 million years ago is really significant in the evolution of the limestone coast, because it means that we gained a coastline and our land could be built by coastal processes. So there's a little video here to give you a good mental picture of the separation of Australia from the supercontinents. The video is hopefully loads for you, yeah. It's taken from the point of view of Antarctica, and we start 200 million years ago. So it will skip through a little bit here at the start with our dinosaurs just munching away, and then we're looking straight above Antarctica. So you can see that things start to move here. We're skipping through millions of years, so you got to keep in mind Earth was formed 4.6 billion years ago. And we're rapidly going through the millions and millions of years. We've got finally Australia and Antarctica about to split up, and New Zealand, hello over there. And Australia is moving north. So and Antarctica cools at that point. So essentially, what we've got here is in that process there are rocks being laid down, and I guess different processes happening with water, wind, heat, all different I guess, elemental processes that will lay down rocks and create what we have today being the Earth's crust. So in the southeast, if we go from the right-hand side of our screen, which is Naracoorte, to the left-hand side of our screen, which is Kingston, if we cut through there like a slice of cake, this is what we have. So right down below us today, we have what I call the Kanmantu group, which are our basement rocks. Now, they're coloured in pink, so if you can see on the centre column there, they're between 500 million years old and 141 million years old. So they took about 400 million years, or yeah, thereabouts, to lay down. They are igneous rocks, so volcanic, essentially from the Earth's mantle. The second group on top of that, so they're younger, they've been laid down after, is the Otway supergroup. They're sandstones and siltstones, which are sedimentary rocks. So they're not laid down by volcanic processes. They settle out of through your wind or water erosion usually, or in basins. Then atop that is the Dune Formation, which is a mudstone, a lot younger than either of the other two rock layers above it, so 55 million to 48 million years old. Then our synonymous Gambia limestone, which the Limestone Coast is named after. That's a fossiliferous limestone layer, and it was deposited in an open marine shelf environment. Now, that one is basically, if you look at the last column now, I've got ocean. No, there's no ocean for the first 3 units. But when the Gambia limestone was formed, it was formed when the ocean was in. So that, I guess when Australia rifted apart from Antarctica, that basically opened up a depression in the crust, and that depression was able to fill up with shallow water. It deposited the sediments for the Dune Formation, and that gave way as it moved north. It was able to fill then with the Gambia limestone, which is a marine limestone, and we know that because we find a lot of fossils in it. We know that from the chemistry of that rock. Now, atop that, the Parilla sands came in, the Kumanduke, shallow marine limestone and clay came in, and the Bridgewater and Pathway formations. Now you can see right at the top there, the Bridgewater and Pathway formations. They're really young, they're less than 1 million years old, and that's what makes up our dunes. Now, the important bit there is the dunes were formed when the ocean was in and out. So basically where we're at now, and they're in the yellow at the top. So this is really plain and simple. I hope everyone understands that the years of the age of the rocks being laid down is sequential, and what you see today is the youngest stuff on top. But maybe not, because this is what it looks like in reality. It's less like a cake slice and more like an eaten mess. We've got different processes that come in to form the different base units. So one in particular that I will take you to right now on our first stop today is the Canolinka Fault line. Hopefully that's loading for you. Yep. So the Canolinka Fault occurred about 2 million, or from 2 million years ago. It uplifted the Naracoorte Range area, dividing basically east of the Naracoorte Range and west of the Naracoorte Range, and that really influenced what happened from that point forward with the soils in this area. So that was really important because faulting in the Gambia limestone started the cave forming process for the world famous Naracoorte caves. So when the Gambia limestone fractured, slightly acidic groundwater would flow through the fractures, dissolve the calcium carbonate in the limestone, and that would create channels and cavities. And those channels and cavities over time have really enlarged to form beautiful cave structures that we have today. So we're looking on the first map here. If you can follow the West Naracoorte Range in yellow down to where the red unit butts up against it, you'll see Canolinka Fault there between the two. In the centre map, you can see it vertical, where the Naracoorte Range is sitting on top, and you've got the Parilla Sands on one side of that and the Naracoorte Range on the other. And on the right-hand side of your screen, that's an elevation map. So that's the entire Limestone Coast. And you can see where it's really dark brown there and contrasts with the green and the yellow. That's where the fault popped up, showing the different topographical relief there across the region. So we'll come back to that map as well. So our first postcard you can send home is from the Naracoorte Caves. The second destination is our Dune drive-by, so Naracoorte to the Coorong. Now this is, as you can see down the, oh, I'm lagging behind, sorry. I can see that on my other screen. All right, we're caught up. So you'll be forgiven for thinking that the sand in all of our dunes as we go across from Naracoorte to the coast is all the same sand. However, there's about 100,000 years between each dune popping up, or the formation of those dunes. So the dunes here are formed by sea level rise and retreat. So the ocean would come in and create a Coorong-like system where the sand would deposit out in dune formations and other sediments would wash in to form the plains in that shallow marine environment. So really important. The Naracoorte Range is about 800,000 years old, and as you cross the Harper and Stewart's Range, you're about 725,000 years. Wollongbil through to Baker, Arjun, East Avenue Range. East Avenue, you're hitting about 404,000 years. West Avenue Range popped up at about 342,000 years. Then we've got Reedy Creek and then out to the Coorong today, which is geology in process, I guess, like in action, which is less than 100,000 years old. So our second postcard today is from the Coorong. Our third destination is the Mount Gambia Volcanics. Now, these volcanics are dormant, not extinct. So the last eruption was about 4,600 years ago, and that's in the Mount Gambia, Mount Schenk complex. The Mount Burr complex is active between 20,000 and 2 million years ago. Now, they're all part of the same volcanic complex of the southeast of Australia that stretches into Victoria as well. Now they're dormant because there's still some activity that's going on deep within the surface, deep below the surface, I should say, rather. But essentially they're igneous rocks, or igneous rocks from lava flows and volcanic bombs and ash fallout. They all weather down to some really fertile soil, which down in the volcanic plains and southern dunes sub-region, you'll have totally different soil types to what you'll see on our dunes and flats as well. So Mel will talk about that a little bit in the upcoming webinars as well. Now up in the top right-hand corner, we've got the same elevation map, and you can see what an influence those volcanics have had on forming different soils, I guess, through into Victoria. So they really do stretch across the border. So a really significant influence on water flows and where the productive land is for agriculture today. So our next postcard that we'll send home to everybody will be from, if it loads, Mount Schenk. Hopefully that will. Can anyone see that? Yep, there we go, Mount Schenk. Now, I'm going to take you through some other significant destinations, I guess, on throughout the Limestone Coast. So sinkholes are one other feature that we see down here a lot. They relate back to our cave structures. So they're essentially near surface caves, fractured through limestone potentially. The overlying soil or softer rock roofs collapse, especially with water filtering through them. So they are a really important source of groundwater for Indigenous people back when they were roaming around the region. Essentially, they're significant because of the geology that's in place in the region. Another important feature of our landscape are our lagoons. So Bull Lagoon is the largest of the lagoons that was formed during that plain and dune formation process, so the ocean coming in and out. And essentially they're a crescent-shaped sort of erosive formation called a lunette, and they fill up with water seasonally. So this is a really important feature of our landscape down here because Bull Lagoon is actually a Ramsar wetland of world significance. So it's got important biodiversity impacts for our region, but also globally for migratory birds as well. So we need to look after those features as well. We also have some granite outcrops. Now, when I was putting this presentation together, I was going to put this up front, but it thoroughly confused Mel as to how they fit into the picture in terms of why do they exist. Now, these granite outcrops, like the granites, Mount Monster and Christmas rocks, are all very different ages. They are the oldest rocks in the Limestone Coast at Cambrian Ordovician age, which means that they were, back when Australia was part of Pangaea, these guys existed then. So we know that from dating from the chemical content, I guess, of the rocks. And you can imagine like we started splitting off, or Pangaea existed 300 million years ago. These guys are another 100, 170, 200-ish million years older than that. So how they formed was they're post-tectonic rocks that are intrusive. So they essentially bubbled up towards the surface, but didn't necessarily break the surface because we know from the crystal structure in them that they slowly cooled in as intrusive rocks. So they've got characteristics that we know that's how they formed. Now, granite is really hard and it weathers slowly. So these big intrusive bubbles would have floated to the surface, or pushed their way to the surface rather, cooled slowly, and there would have been crusts of rock above them that they would have intruded into. Those have eroded away, and obviously the southeast as well, being relatively young in terms of all its other geology, it has formed and weathered and formed and weathered, and now all we can see are these caps of small remnants of each of these formations. So our last destination that I'll take you to today is our Kunawa Terra. Now, this is, I guess, not a geological feature in terms of being a rock, but it is a significant tourist destination in my mind. It has a different, I guess, process involved with creating this kind of geology, and that was it's a wind deposition process, so an aeolian deposition. So it blew in about 120,000 years ago and is very important for our, I guess, our synonymous other industry being our wine industry. So I'm going to leave it there with our wine and cheese to cap off our little road trip, and I'm going to ask Mel to come in from behind the screen to then present her talk. Thank you. Cheers.
Cheers, Claire. This is for you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Yeah, I thought you might need a drink to.
Thank you. Debrief.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Well
Thanks,
done.
guys. It's fine.
Sure.
I'll just go slow.
No worries. All right, we'll let Claire duck out. Thank you for that, Claire, for taking us on that trip around the Limestone Coast. I think it's a really great way to introduce the evolution of this landscape and the soils that have formed. And it's really important that we do understand that, because it really impacts the kind of soils that you've got, but also the kind of agriculture or livelihood that you can pursue as well across this region. So Claire just spoke to you about rocks and gobstoppers. Essentially things that aren't living. And what I want you to think about when you think about your soils outside in your paddocks or in your garden, wherever you're coming from today, is to actually think of soils as the living skin of planet Earth, a bit like an apple. So an apple also, you know, has a core, just like Claire explained, being a core in the earth. And our soils really do breathe and drink and feed and digest and provide life. So just like the skin on an apple that you can see here, I want you to think about the soil being this living, breathing skin of planet Earth that we all rely on. So when it comes to soils across the Limestone Coast, the first thing to be aware of is that all of the soils across South Australia's agricultural land have been mapped to some degree. And within that mapping system, the way that we identify different soil types across our state is to break them down into soil groups. So there are 15 soil groups across the agricultural lands of South Australia, and they're named from the letter A through to the letter O. And of those 15 groups, we have 13 of those in the Limestone Coast. Within those soil groups are subgroups, and so for example, soil group B has 9 subgroups within it, so they basically describe all of the different chemical and physical and hydrological characteristics of the different soils that exist within that group. There's only 2 of the actual soil groups that we don't have here. That's soil group J, which is ironstone soils, and soil group K, which are moderately deep acidic soils on rock. And essentially those soil types only exist on the Eyre Peninsula, on Kangaroo Island, and through the Adelaide Mount Lofty ranges down to the Fleurieu Peninsula. So we do have a vast array of different soils here in the Limestone Coast. And like Claire said, they've actually all formed only in the last sort of 800,000 years as the ocean has come in and retreated again to form the coastal relic dunes that we see in the landscape that we farm today. So of our total agricultural land or total land mass across the Limestone Coast, there's about 2.7 million hectares. And like I said, we have 13 groups. There's actually 54 subgroups in there, or soil types, different soil types in those groups, not 62 like it says on the slide. So apologies for my typo there. But of these, we have 3 major ones in the Limestone Coast. Before I talk about those though, what I thought I'd do is just start with a bit of soil terminology just in case. So you'll hear me talking about soil profiles. So essentially what you can see here on the screen are 2 different soil profiles. This is a sand over clay soil and a calcareous clay over limestone soil. So these are soil profiles. Soils have layers just like a cake, and we call these horizons. So in this case, this is the surface A horizon over a B horizon. So sometimes in our soils we'll have an O horizon, which reflects the organic layer at the top. You'll find these particularly, in forests and scrub areas where you've got lots of coarse leaf material. So that's an O horizon, O for organic. And then we have our first horizon, which is an A horizon. And we can break those up into A1 horizons or A2 or A3 horizons. So in this case, we've got an A1 horizon, which is grey. The tape measure here, each of these increments reflects 10 centimetres. So we've got a bit of grey, A1 horizon to about 15 or 20 centimetres. And then we have a bleached horizon underneath that, which we're going to call an A2 horizon, with a really distinct interface between this A horizon and this clay-rich B horizon underneath. So that's the first thing, I guess, to be aware of, and you'll hear me talking about horizons and layers and profiles and depths in the soil. The other one is if I'm talking about surface soils, I mean anything in the top 10 centimetres. If I say subsurface, it's 10 to 20 centimetres, and if I say subsoil, then it's anything beneath 30 centimetres. So forgive me if you hopefully you can follow what I'm saying as I go through and explain our different soil types over the course of our webinars that I'm really delighted to be delivering. The other thing that we have in soils in the Limestone Coast, so not surprisingly, is lots of limestone. So there's different forms of calcium carbonate basically that's present in the Limestone Coast. And the first of these is called calcrete, and calcrete's actually laid down in terrestrial conditions, so open to the atmosphere, and they're formed through soil wetting and drying processes. So calcium carbonate and soil water solution, which can evaporate off or be used by plants, and it can precipitate into soils to form different layers of consolidated rock, basically. Sometimes it can be really fine, marley type carbonate material with clay through it, and other times it will be quite hard. The other actual limestone that you'd be familiar with are those things like the Gambia limestone that Claire mentioned before, that were actually laid down when the ocean was in. So they're actually fossiliferous calcium carbonates that have been laid down under that sort of shallow column of warm water and laid out through a biological process under the ocean. So they are different, and I'll often refer to them either as calcareous or limestone, but they are mostly made of calcium carbonate. So, of our three major soil groups, the first is a group B. So these are our shallow soils on calcrete and limestone. They make up about 805,000 hectares of the region. Our next major group is the group G soils, which are sand over clay, at about 600,000 hectares. And our third most common is our group H, or deep sandy soils, at about 480,000 hectares. So these three soil groups alone make up 70% of the land mass through the Limestone Coast. They are the areas that are mostly farmed for agriculture and also for forestry on some of the deep sands. And I'm going to take you through now and explain and show you some of the soil profiles that are associated with each of these soil groups. So, of these Group B shallow soils on calcrete, the first major soil types in there that make up 200,000 hectares of that are the calcareous limes. These are subgroups, the calcareous limes and clays over calcrete or limestone. These are soils that feature on our plains. So you can see from the Narracourt, if we're over here and we take that transect again over to Kingston or to Robe, like Claire took you on that journey before, these are the kinds of soils that you would see across the Narracourt Plain and basically south of this line between Narracourt, Lucindale and Kingston are these black soil plains. So the Avenue Plain, Furner, Conmurra, Millicent, all the way down through Tantanoola around to Mount Gambia, you will find these soils which are very rich in loam and clay. They have a high inherent fertility because they commonly contain a lot of smectite clay minerals. These are the ones that can shrink and swell. They have a very high ability to retain nutrients. But they also come with some limitations as well. And the first of those, as you can see in this particular photo, is a shallow water table. So in this particular profile, we can see we've got 30 centimetres of soil over a hard calcrete, which goes down through the profile, and then we've got water from the groundwater sitting there at about 1.1 metres. So this is really common from these plains. I'm sure you are all aware that in the summertime we'll see the water tables, the groundwater levels drop to sort of 1 to 1.5 metres below the surface of the soil. And commonly we would see this water table rise through the winter time this is an unconfined aquifer, shallow unconfined aquifer, rises to the surface during the winter time with rainfall. And so usually by the time we get to August, this water table has come all the way to the surface or has breached the surface, and you would then get flowing water across the landscape, which flows in this southeasterly to northwesterly direction across all of those dunes, and eventually now makes its way into drainage networks and gets taken out to the ocean. So that's our first major impediment, is the fact that we have this fluctuating groundwater through the region, which of course can slow our, our growth of crops and pastures, or in some cases even kill them. What comes with that groundwater, of course, is some salt, and that salt can also be, high enough in concentration to be toxic to plants. And the thing that it leaves behind when it drops down again is excess sodium in the soil. So we can see the expression of sodicity in soils like this, which is where our soils lose their structural degradation, or they lose their structural stability, and they degrade with water because of that excess sodium, and they become very boggy when they're wet, and then they can set really hard when they're dry. The other limitation, of course, to crop growth here is this very hard cap that we see across the top of the calcrete. And so that actually stops roots from going down and in penetrating down deeper into the profile where there is water. So in the webinars that we've got coming up after the school holidays in August, I will be talking about these constraints in more detail across these different soil types, and some of the strategies that are being used at the moment, things like refernating and ripping rocks to improve root access to the groundwater, lowering the profile as we move through our season. Drainage, of course, in these soil types is imperfect, because even if the water can move down through them, you've got that water table from below, which is going to hold things up. So in terms of their their ability to supply water to a crop, which is their available water or their water holding capacity, they can hold between 50 to 100 millimetres, but of course that's determined by the depth of this soil. What's the water holding capacity, I hear you ask? Essentially, if you took a soil and we filled it up with water so that it was at saturation, and then we let it drain for 24 hours, and we came back and we took a soil sample and we measured how much water was in there, that tells us how much water is actually available to the crop, and what the soil can hold after it's had free drainage. So it is a good measure of the soil type and how productive it can be. Right, moving on to our next subgroup of Group B soils is our sands and our sandy limes over clay or directly over calcrete. And so you can see in this particular profile here, we have a shallow A horizon, which looks very sandy to loamy. In here, over a very thin lens of clay over a calcrete. And so these are really common kinds of soils that we get either in our dunes through the region or on our plains, and more so as we go drier as we move to the north. So we get more of those black soils in these southern areas on the plains, and then as we move north towards Meningi, and certainly in the lower rainfall areas around Keith, Tintinara and Canalpin, we typically find these sands and sandy limes directly on calcrete. They have a very low inherent fertility, so because they are a sandy soil, they can't hold on to a lot of nutrients, they don't hold on to a lot of water, and they can be prone to the development of water repellence and erosion. So they are mostly well drained, but they don't hold on to much water to keep our crops alive. So you really need to rely on regular rainfall to produce, productive crops on these soil types. The calcrete in these is usually within 50 centimetres, so you've got a really limited kind of bucket for roots to explore. And those soils make up, 460,000 hectares across our region, so they are a really significant soil type, and they do come with their challenges. Okay, so the final subgroup B soil that I want to talk about today, it's only a minor one, unfortunately, at 29,000 hectares, but I thought we better mention it, particularly because that's where Claire stopped on her journey today, is this red loam on limestone. So this is also a Group B soil, aka the Terra Rossa. So these soils generally are well-structured red sandy loam or loam soils. And again, you can see them on this consolidated calcrete material, which can be either limestone or calcrete. So, but generally it's hardened through rock forming processes in a terrestrial environment. So what we find is that these particular soil types have a moderately low to moderately high inherent fertility, and that's determined by the amount of clay that's in them. They generally contain a lot of calcium, and any home gardener knows that gypsum is a clay breaker, and of course the component of gypsum that does that is the calcium. And so any soil that has a high saturation of calcium generally has good structure. It's that pesky sodium I was talking about before that makes the structure of our soils break down. These soils are mostly well drained, and their water hold capacity is really linked to that depth to calcrete. So these soil types, are mostly around this Panola district, as you would all know. So I thought it was worth a mention, even though it doesn't make up a lot of the area. So the next soil group that I would like to introduce you to is soil group G, which is the sand over clay. Just wait for that to load. Here we go. So our sand over clay soils, like I said, represent over 600,000 hectares across the region. They occur through the dunes, but also on this plain south of Lucindale and sort of through Wollongbil and north of Lucindale up to Killara. And So you can see this area in here. This is the only plain in the limestone coast that actually has a sand over clay soil. All the other interdural plains, the ones in between all of those old relic coastlines, are dominated with those clay soils over limestone, where this particular plain is dominated by sand over clay. As we move to the north of the region, it's more associated with our deep sands from coastal deposition rather than being interdural plains. So these particular soils generally have a grey organic surface A1 horizon, and then underneath that usually is a bleached sandy horizon, so very white, can be anywhere between sort of 15 centimetres and 90 centimetres deep in this particular instance. And these subsoils are basically devoid of any nutrients, so they are not very fertile soils. They don't contain any phosphorus. They don't have a lot of organic carbon, which means we don't have good nitrogen cycling. They can also be really prone to acidity, and also to aluminium, which comes into solution and can be toxic to plants. And so you'll commonly see on these soil types, you'll see things like silvergrass and sorrel really proliferate. You'll see over time, you'll see lucerne drop out and any of your other productive pasture species as well. But the benefit of these soils is that if you've got a clay B horizon within sort of 50 to 60 centimetres, then you can delve these soils and bring that clay up to the surface, or you can open up clay pits as well, and you can use that clay for clay spreading. So these soils are rapidly drained through the surface sandy soil horizons, but underneath, when we get down to that clay B horizon, the one that we can delve and that we can also use for clay spreading, you do have to be a bit careful with those soils, because they commonly contain sodium, so they can be sodic, so they can be that shrink swell. They can be the soils that are dominated with sodium that then break down when they're wet and boggy, and so you can get stuck. They can also contain high sodium chloride as well, so salt, so you need to be aware of that. And sometimes as well, they can have accumulations of boron in them, which can be toxic to plants. So I guess they are both a blessing and a curse to have clay underneath your sand rather than calcrete. But you do need to know, I guess, what the limitations are in those B horizons, probably before you go delving or clay spreading, but also be aware that they might be, even though they're highly fertile and can hold a lot of water down lower, that they might actually be stopping plant growth because of a chemical toxicity. So moving on to the final major soil group that I want to introduce you to today. This is soil group H. So these are the deep sands, and so you can see over here on my slide, Claire explained before about the evolution of the sand dunes and the interdunal plains through the limestone coast. The fact that they formed over the course of the last 800,000 years, so the Narracort, the east and the west Narracort ranges being the oldest, and you go across the Narracort plain and you get the Stewarts and the Bakers and the Harpers and the Wollongbool, and across to Lucendale, and you get the Arjun and the East Avenue and the West Avenue and the Reedy Creek and the Workwine. And so as we go across the landscape, we tend to get these accumulations of deep sand, and these reflect that that movement of the ocean as it has gone out to our current day coastline. So these sands can have, again, that sort of grey layer at the top, but it drops off into a bleached sand, so increasing colour with depth, but generally these soils are rapidly drained. They can't hold onto a lot of water in the surface layers. They have a very low inherent fertility, so not a lot of nutrients there to start with, and they can't hold on to much if you put it in. Things like phosphorus can actually leach on soil types like this in the high rainfall environment. And yeah, they generally occur along the dunes. The other sand, which is really similar to these, are the highly leached sands on the plains, which are the ones down sort of from Kalangadoo across to Malel and around Mount Gambia. There's 117,000 hectares of those Group I highly leached sands, and they are quite similar, I guess, in their characteristics with these soils. So again, they are susceptible to water repellents, the development of water repellents in the surface, and they can also be susceptible to wind erosion as well. There are some other, I guess, agriculturally important soil types that are only minor in terms of their area, but are still important soils that we use for cropping and for grazing. The first of these is the Group E soils, which are cracking clay soils that we find these up around Wolseley, Bordertown, and south of Wolseley, Poojnagorrick, sort of through that area around to Bordertown and across the highway. These soils can be typically alkaline, have a high pH, but we've actually found that the pH is dropping in recent years as a consequence of sort of high nitrogen use in legumes. So they're actually responding really well to lime applications, and some of them are also naturally acidic to start with. They're only a minor soil type, but again, highly productive from a cropping perspective, from a winter cropping perspective, because they can hold on to nutrients and also to quite a lot of water. If we look at our Group F soils, our deep, loamy texture contrast soils, these are the soils that have basically all been held up behind the east and west Narracort range. So if you remember, you know, Claire explained about the Canolinka Fault line. So essentially we had a land surface that was flat, and the Canolinka Fault line popped up and caused the new beach, if you like. So the ocean now is here and we've got a beach dune forming. And so that dune, as it's forming and the fault line when it pops up, causes a barrier to any surface waters that were flowing across from Victoria. And so behind that, we've got a build-up of these deep, loamy texture contrast soils. So we find with those soils, they can be very silty. They can have a bit of ironstone or coffee rock through them at depth. They're generally acidic as well. They increase with their clay content with depth. And while they are relatively fertile soils, they can still get very waterlogged and very wet. And set very hard, and they can be dispersive, and sometimes they're acidic. So these soils, particular soils, can be a challenge to work with, but there are also options as well to overcome the constraints in them. So about 130,000 hectares of those ones. The last group, I know Claire also mentioned the volcanics and the volcanic history through this region, so I thought it was worth mentioning. We do have about 15,000 hectares of volcanic soils down here around Mount Gambia. These really are the most fertile soils, probably most definitely in South Australia. I'm not sure how they compare to our eastern seaboard, but you know, these soils are generally very friable. They have a high inherent fertility. They can retain a lot of nutrients. They also contain a lot of phosphorus and sulphur, which is something which is missing completely from all of our sandy soils across the rest of the landscape. So while I'm not advocating for Mount Gambia to erupt anytime soon, if it did and it could send some flows my way, I probably would be upset to start with, but maybe not in another few thousand years. So that's the end of the introduction, I guess, to the evolution of the landscape across the Limestone Coast, and an introduction to our soils for now. Really, we intended this as a bit of a taste to get you familiar with the soils across the Limestone Coast. I would like to acknowledge two sources for the information that we've presented today. A lot of the information has come from a document called The Soils of Southern South Australia, and I would really like to acknowledge David Mashman. Most of the photos that were in my presentation are photos of David's that he collected through his long career working for South Australian government mapping soils across the state. Him and James Hall did a lot of work. So the particular book, and I recommend that you track this one down, you should be able to get it from Adelaide, from one of the government departments. Contact me if you're interested and I can send you the details. It's called The Soils of Southern South Australia, and it usually retails for about $50, and it is an absolutely excellent resource. I did have mine here, but I've shifted it. It explains all of those soil groups and subgroups across the state, the fertility of each of those, the challenges and the opportunities for farming them. So I absolutely recommend you get your hands on that resource. The other one is called Unearthing Viticulture in the Limestone Coast. This particular document has a really great explanation of the geological evolution of this region, and it's available online. So make sure you look that one up as well. So like I said, we intended today's content to really be, I guess, an eye-opener to the evolution of this region. If you come back, please, and join me again on the 2nd of June, I will be presenting I guess, a bit of an overview on what makes our soils fertile. So looking at the chemical, the physical and the biological components of our soils that keep them healthy and functioning well. So that we have, healthy functioning soils, so we have healthy, functioning growing plants, which then feeds healthy livestock, which then feeds healthy humans. So I guess that's where I'll be coming from with that webinar. Our colleague, Dr Amanda Chappell, will be joining us on the 23rd of June to talk about soil carbon and also introducing some more concepts around soil biology. And then we're going to have a break for the school holidays, and we're going to come back on the 28th of July. I'll actually be coming to you from Toolibuk in Victoria, where I'm doing a sandy soil tour, and I'll be talking about how we improve the productivity on our sandy soils. So I talked today a little bit about some of the constraints that exist in our sandy soils. I'll be talking more about those, how you go about identifying constraints on your own farm, and then what options you've got for treating those. And then back on the 18th of August, we'll be doing the same thing for our clay soils as well. So I'll be introducing and discussing, I guess, those individual soil groups and subgroups in a bit more detail, and then providing you with some, I guess, some handy tips and tools on how to go about exploring the soils on your own farm or in your own backyard, so you can improve the health and the fertility of the landscape around you. With that, I'm going to hand back to Skyly, who is going to run us through any questions that you might have. Come on in, Claire. For me, thank you.
Well done.
Okay. At the moment, we haven't got any questions in the chat bar, so I'm sort of.
Do you have a question, Skyly?
I guess my question, if I was going to ask a question, yeah, I think I've sat through a couple of presentations by you and Claire before, but if you can, yeah, I guess the formation, something that resonated with me in one of them was, the Coorong used to be at Lucendale and then has moved back. Is that correct when you said that? And that was something that I sort of went, oh, that makes sense now when you drive over the dunes and things like that. Is that still correct, or am I was supposed to ask on the day and I always...
No, that's exactly right, Skyly. You've got that right. So if we think back to that, when the Canolinka Fault line popped up, it popped up how many million? Couple of minutes ago. Yeah, so the Canolinka Fault line popped up. The ocean at the time was in, out, and then the ocean came in, and the fault line then is where the east and the west Narracort ranges formed, and we've got a dune, sitting here now, and the ocean was in. Fast forward 100,000 years, and the ocean then goes out, and that's the consequence of glaciation. We're in different glacial period, and the ocean retreats, and then it comes back in again when things warm up, and it formed the next one. I think it's the Stewart's Range is the next one. So if we look out across the Narracort Plain now, we've got about 5 kilometres. We go from this dune range where I am at the moment. I'm sitting up on the hill in Narracort, and we go across the Narracort Plain, and we hit the next set of ranges. When the ocean was up against those second set of ranges, in between we end up with this lagoonal system with this shallow column of water in it, which is fed by water from the ocean through the tides. It comes up shallow, but also water which is travelling across the landscape as well, and rainfall. And so you end up with this seasonal lagoonal body of water, which exactly reflects the system that we've got now in the Coorong. So as you drive down the Coorong Road, if you're heading from Meningie to Kingston, you're driving along a road which is up against an old relic dune. You look across a plain, and you've got the new coastline, which is, the ocean's just on the other side of that, and you've got this plain in between, which is filled with shallow water, which is influenced by water from the lakes, the lower lakes, from the Murray, the ocean, and surface waters which come across and feed through the lagoonal systems from the south. and it's laying down, you know, carbonate-rich muds. It's got shells in it. It's got sea life in it. It's very salty, but it has a lot of calcium and magnesium and sodium in it as well. And so it's forming these new calcrete layers underneath. It's got marly muds in it and some water, and if the ocean was to go out again, that would then dry out and become an interdunal plain, just like the ones that we see here. So we've essentially got that process replicated across our region over the course of the last 800,000 years.
Thank you. Yeah, I was on the right track.
Yes, you were. Yeah.
And it's funny when you said that, I actually the next time I drove across, I actually took notice and I was like, oh, I can see it now, like it. And before, I'd never done that before. So yeah, thank you. I'm just having a look here. Yeah, no, there's no more questions at the moment. So I think we might call it a webinar, I guess. Yeah, thank you both so much. It was, yeah, really, really good, very informative. I love the postcards. It's sort of, yeah, it was great. Mel, the maps and being able to, I always enjoy looking at those because I'm like, when I travel around, I'm like, oh, I'm on this sort of, soil now. And yeah, it was really, really informative and interesting. So thank you very, very much. And I'm getting lots of comments now just saying, yeah, very informative, easy to understand, and looking forward to the next sessions. That was from Adrian. So
excellent. We're looking forward to them too. So please do join us again.
Yeah, thank you very much.